topics and opinions expressed in the following show are solely those of the host and their guests and not those of W4CY Radio, its employees, or affiliates. We make no recommendations or endorsements for radio show programs, services, or products mentioned on air or on our web. No liability, explicit or implied, shall be extended to W4CY Radio or its employees or affiliates. Any questions or comments should be directed to those show hosts. Thank you for choosing W4CY Radio.
Well, good morning. Great to have you with us. Bill Martinez here, along with Steve Bonta, the publisher of the New American Magazine. Steve Bonta, good to have you with us. How are you, sir?
Good to be here, Bill.
Well, lots to talk about. Congratulations on the New American Magazine. Just incredible articles I want to make sure our audience is aware of, because if you're not getting the New American, you need to get it. Just excellent writing on the Epstein Files, which we're going to talk about. What about the Epstein Files? Who cares and why should we care? It was quite the expose. Well done. And of course, the other is that we're going to start off talking about is the Iran war and our Constitution. The Democrats are quick to talk about, well, is this, are we obliterating our Constitution by supporting and trying to save the Iranian people?
Okay, so start the Iran war then?
Yes. Start with the Iran war.
So, yeah, I think at this point, Bill, leaving aside everything else as to whether or not it's a righteous cause and all that type of thing, which we can talk about as well, but from a strictly constitutional standpoint, the war is really not constitutionally embarked upon, because there's an argument to be made, I suppose, in times of exigency for the president maybe to be able to act unilaterally. It is a fact, for example, that during the debate of the Constitutional Convention there was some discussion as to whether the clause in Article 1, Section 8 should give to Congress the power to, quote unquote, make war. And they decided, well, we should say declare war, because we can envision circumstances where the president, the executive branch, might need to make war as a result of some emergency, a surprise invasion or national expediency where there's no time for deliberation.
Right.
But that said, why is that clause in there at all? Okay, why is it there if Congress has not, in fact, declared war since World War II? This is an unavoidable fact that nobody wants to talk about, including Trump's boosters. And this is not a partisan issue, because obviously Trump is not the first president to do this. The Venezuelan thing a few months ago was, I could see honest arguments on both sides of that one, because it didn't turn into a war. Acts of war and war are two different things.
I was going to say that they're begging for a definition, are they not?
Yeah, well, in the case of Iran, I just think that it's kind of like the old Supreme Court quote on pornography. So I say, I can't necessarily define what war is, but I know it when I see it, and that's kind of what we got here. We've clearly got. Although there's a ceasefire, which I also find kind of incomprehensible. I don't really understand what Trump is trying to do with that, but that's another issue. But we're still in a state of war. We have unleashed total you-know-what on Iran and killed lots of people, destroyed an awful lot of stuff, and they have responded in kind. And it's a major theater war. There's no question about that. And yet Congress really was not involved in any degree. I mean, leaving aside
they've only had 47 years to get involved, Steve. I mean, Iran has been causing problems, killing Americans over the years. And this thing has just been ignored and processed, down the road. And meanwhile, Americans keep getting killed. And now we're in a situation where 47 years later, you've got a president who wants to do something about it, and Congress, instead of being proactive about it, they should have assembled right away when this was coming, in my humble opinion, and hey, let's debate this, let's figure this out, but also help us understand, in terms of your understanding of this, is that I understand the president can, you know, I guess make or he can't declare it. That has to be done by Congress. But make war, he's got so many days in which he's authorized to do it, does he not?
Yeah, 60 days, and the time on that is almost running out anyway. That's according to a separate statute. That's not constitutional. That's statutory. And but I mean and here's another point that needs to be made. I mean, Trump is obviously acting on a precedent that's been set by virtually every president from here, going all the way back to Truman.
Right.
And here's the unavoidable fact that we have to understand. Why is it that since 1941, well, from 1945, so the end of World War II, okay, we have been involved in a number of major theater wars: the Korean War, the Vietnam War, the Gulf War, this war, the Iraq War, and we might even throw in the wars in Yugoslavia, the Balkan Wars, and not to mention many minor things like the invasion of Panama, relatively minor, and so forth. Probably not minor for the Panamanians, but nevertheless. And not once has there been a declaration of war. Not once. Has it been taken out of the Constitution? Well, it's still there, but we don't do it. So this is problematic. So I'm not, I mean, basically Trump is just doing what other presidents have done before him. The Persian Gulf War was fought under UN authority, and so Trump, I mean, I guess the thing that gets people unhappy in Congress is not so much that he's out there waging war in Iran, it's that he's doing it without any authority other than that of the executive branch. If he had gone to the United Nations and sought some sort of Security Council resolution or invoked UN authority, it might be a different thing. But both of those are illegitimate. Both of those are illegitimate means of going to war. The fact is, and there's no question that Iran has given the U.S. multiple Casai Bellorum over the decades, starting with the seizure of our embassy personnel back in 1979. And they've carried out innumerable attacks on Americans. They've carried out terrorist attacks in the Western Hemisphere. The bombing of the Jewish Cultural Center in Buenos Aires back in the mid 1990s was carried out by Iranian agents, killed a huge number of people. So there's no, and unlike, people who talk about this and say, well, this is just America butting into other countries' affairs, intervening in wars that are none of our business. Well, there is a difference, and that is that Iran has declared itself the enemy of the United States. I mean, Saddam Hussein's Iraq never did that. Syria never did that. Libya kind of maybe did a little bit for a while, but then got away from that. And so in many cases, yes, we have embarked on wars that are purely interventionist in spirit, and have to do with nebulous outcomes like preserving world order or enforcing UN Security Council resolutions, things like this. But in this case, it is certainly true that Iran is the declared enemy of the United States. They act like the enemy. They've acted, all this time.
Yes,
so
exactly.
It's not like they're a third party, and it's not like this is completely none of our business. I don't subscribe to the narrative that we're hearing that, well, we're just doing Israel's dirty work for them. But but still, ultimately, I mean that is, you're talking there about other issues which we can talk about, but the declaration of war thing is, as far as I'm concerned, an unassailable concern. But it's something that's long past due that we need to resolve. Otherwise, we're going to end up with a permanent state of elective Caesarism here, where the president has the de facto, if not the de jure, authority to commit us to war anytime he wants, for whatever reasons.
Well, you're exactly right. I mean, these decisions need to be anchored, but it's like, well, here we are, and for all intent and purposes, we've been at war. Well, actually, Iran's been at war with us for 47 years. America just kind of just ignored it until, it got to a point where you just could not ignore it. And, this is after Obama gave him $1.5 billion of, of cash on pallets in the middle of the night, that hopefully they would make nice. And what did they do? I mean, they took that money and just doubled down on their terrorist investments. We're talking with Steve Bonta. He is the publisher of the New American Magazine. Well, Steve, again, I appreciate you coming on and talking about this because, we hear all the talking points from, Hakeem Jeffries and the rest of the Democrats, and, this is an illegal war. And I mean, it's hard to hear when I'm seeing our military, our sons and daughters there putting their life on the line for the sake of our national security. And you've got this partisan bickering that's going on. And it's like, wait a minute, where you guys have been? Where have you been for the last 47 years?
Yeah, well, I mean, again, that's a separate issue. And let me be clear. I mean, my personal position on this is, having embarked upon it, we need to finish the job, and the world will be much better off, and certainly the Iranian people will be much better off without this horrific regime in power. We saw what they were capable of, back in January, when they went out and butchered tens of thousands of their people. And they continue, by the way, on a daily basis,
right,
to hang beautiful young women whose only crime was to appear in public without a hijab and say Javid Shah or something like that. I mean, it's just the horrors continue unabated in that country right now. Now, it's not necessarily our role to go out there and to be savior of the world in a secular sense, because there are horrors going on in Sudan, and there are horrors going on in Myanmar, Burma, horrors going on in communist China, and so forth and so on. And so that is probably not in and of itself a legitimate mandate. But my point is, having committed so much already, we should finish. But it doesn't look like we're going to finish, because suddenly we started in the early days saying, only unconditional surrender. And now we're shucking and jiving and joking and changing, and it's just, and Trump is playing five-dimensional chess. You just don't understand. No, I do understand. Trump has gotten bored. He's looking at new shiny objects now, and he kind of wants to get out of it. We did not do this when we fought a bona fide foe, the Nazis. And by the way, there are some questionable things about our entry into World War II. Going all the way back. There are people, argue about this to this day. Was there foreknowledge of the Pearl Harbor attack? Did FDR cynically allow it to happen so that he had the pretext to get us in the war? But once we were in the war, however we got there, there was no question. And FDR, right, by the way, lest we forget, was a liberal of the day. He's quite radical in many ways. He's one of the spiritual godfathers of today's radical left. But even he didn't say, okay, well, we're going to have a ceasefire with the Nazis for 2 weeks and see how that goes, or let's shut down operations in the Pacific for a couple of weeks, and while we talk with the Japanese and see if we can cut a deal. It's insane.
Yes.
If you try to project the mentality that Trump seems to be bringing to this very serious conflict, back into wars past, particularly World Wars I and World War II, you say, no, that's not how it's done. I'm not a military man, but even I know, when you fight a war, you fight to win, or you don't get involved at all.
Exactly.
And now,
yeah. You got to let the generals do their job. I'm a firm believer that once they're on the battlefield, what Trump should say, look, you've got my vote. Go get it done, and call me when you're finished.
In effect, yeah. And instead, he's micromanaging it, and he's playing these games. So I'm sorry. But, people were saying the other day, oh, well, the ceasefire is almost over. You'll see. We're just doing it. We're rearming and getting ready. And he's going to go in. And what does he do? Oh, well, we're going to continue with the ceasefire. We're going to talk, see if they can get things together. In other words, he has really no intention of changing the regime. He just wants to cut a deal. And this is just, to me, I find, frankly, quite appalling at this point. And I know a lot of your people are probably hardcore Trump boosters. I'll be happy to be wrong. That maybe he is really playing five-dimensional chess and going to win there. I mean, the world will be in an incomparably better place with an Iran that's a friend of the U.S., is anti-communist, anti-Islamist, friend of Israel, all that sort of thing, as they once were under the much maligned Shah. But I don't know if we're going to get there.
Yeah, I don't blame you. I have the same feeling as you do, Steve, because the situation, again, like I said, is that when you go to war, you just empower the generals, get out of the way, let them do their job. Otherwise we're going to end up with another Vietnam conflict. And what a mess. And I was in the Marine Corps during that period of time. Fortunately, I wasn't on the field of battle, but I was in the public relations department. And that was all. I mean, I saw stuff I didn't want to see, that I can't unsee. But was because it became a war executed by civilians instead of the military. They want to go in and we've had this problem time and time again. And the thing is that even with Donald Trump, I feel for his position. I have compassion as much as that here he's trying to conduct this war. He's got the Democrats nipping at his heels. He's got the mainstream media nipping at his heels. You got all these headwinds coming in, and oh yeah, and as if that's not enough, let's just throw the Pope in there too, okay?
Mhm.
And it's like at some point, I mean, I got to imagine he wakes up in the middle of the night and his short span of sleep, because he only sleeps about 3 or 4 hours a day, they tell us, and probably thinks, what a nightmare. I'm in the middle. I'm twirling plates here, trying to keep this thing going, and and not go in and absolutely obliterate Iran, even though he talked about, which is, the words these people are hanging on to, that he was going to utterly destroy a civilization.
Mhm. Talk is cheap, Bill. And
Yeah.
talk doesn't avail much in war. I mean, I understand that disinformation is an important part of war,
Hmm.
but at this point, come on,
Yeah.
because yes, during the ceasefire, what do you think Iran is doing?
Yeah. Right.
Okay, those cargo flights are still coming in from China and Russia and other points, bringing more munitions, more missiles, more SAM batteries, whatever. And so they're not wasting any time. These guys are hardcore religious fanatics. And I really think that Trump and a lot of people around him do not understand the mentality. They're happy to die.
Right.
They're actually not afraid to die. We saw that on 9/11. One
Right.
of the reasons 9/11 caught us flat-footed is that we didn't, part, as you know, this military man, one of the assumptions is that the enemy on the other side is going to act in his own best interest, that he's going to ultimately want to save his life,
Hmm.
or, and this kind of thing. And there are people who don't think that way. I mean, we were really flummoxed in World War II when the Japanese pilots started flying planes into our own boats.
Kamikazes. Yeah.
Because there was
Exactly.
nothing in our rule book that said, what if you have an entire military corps that is trained to be suicidal?
Yeah.
And that's what we have writ large with the Iranians.
Hmm.
They're not going to, I mean, most Iranians are very rational, good, wonderful people. It's a
Hmm.
it's a small cadre of these true believers who think, they think that there's going to be a great war against the great Satan, us,
Hmm.
and the little Satan, Israel. And at the crucial moment, the Mahdi is going to come and rescue them. So they're very much, they have this Islamist millenarian point of view that
Right.
this is
Exactly.
God's war. That's the point of view, and you can't reason with people like that.
Hmm. Yeah, the only thing on a positive side that's happening within Iran is that Christianity, in the midst of all this persecution, is growing faster in Iran than any other place on the planet right now, Steve.
I hear that, and Christianity has a tendency to proliferate wherever the persecution is the most severe.
Hmm.
So, and sort of the Middle East, Iran, and many other parts of the Muslim world, there's a quiet, conversion going on. Whether
Yeah,
that
because I think it's part of our nature in a sense. When things get chaotic, we want normalcy. Our inner compass, finally gets to that point to say, look, we've got to find some balance. And like you said, Iran's been driven by maybe 10%. I mean, it's almost the same type of fractions that were used in Germany, right? It wasn't that everybody was a Nazi. It was a small percentage that was controlling everybody rather abusively. And they drew no quarter, just like they did with, with the women, the way they, they're not, and even the men, they're not happy enough just to hang them. It's like, no, before we kill you, we're going to brutalize the holy what have you out of you, including rape and gang rapes and things like that these people perpetrate upon, allegedly their own people. They're as barbaric as they come.
Well, and of course, the Iranians stage these raucous rallies, and the people screaming, "Death to America!" And there's defiance in the news media. Oh, look at the popular support the regime has. Yeah, well, you know what? There was popular support at the Nuremberg rally too.
Right.
That was an impressive thing. Those big rallies that Hitler put on, that was
Mhm.
real impressive in terms
Yes.
of PR. There were lots of Germans who were very enthusiastically supportive of Hitler, okay, and lots of Japanese who were very, supportive of the emperor and everything else. That didn't stop us. We didn't
Hmm.
say, "Oh my goodness, this regime is legitimate because look, the people support it. We may not agree with the gas chambers and all that, but the people support it." No, I mean, and so.
No.
It's absurd. And, I mean, obviously, from my vantage point, it's easy for me to argue for absolute, pristine moral clarity and say, well, we should only get involved in wars for defense of our own shores and this kind of thing. And I'm not arguing that either. And I think the founding fathers wouldn't have either. Certainly confronted with the reality of modern weapons like, intercontinental ballistic missiles, we don't have the luxury of saying, well, let the other side of the world unto itself completely. I mean, that should be our default posture. I think that is wise counsel from George Washington and all, to avoid entanglement. And we're nothing if not entangled with most of the rest of the problems of the world. So that needs to be wound down. But there are going to be people out there that are going to hate us and wish us ill and try to do, to knock us off if they possibly can. The Chinese government is certainly one such. And so we do have to have in reserve the possibility that, we may have to do something a little ugly that upsets people, like a preemptive strike or something like that.
Well, exactly. We're talking with Steve Bonta. Steve is the publisher of the New American Magazine. Steve, I guess to summarize, what we've been talking about here is that a lot of people want to focus their anger and disdain toward Donald Trump, but shouldn't we focus it towards Congress, that they're the ones that should, get this cleared up? As you say, this has been going on for decades, and the horse is out of the barn. And how can we get it back in so that, for future presidencies, that whatever is that, happens of a military action, that it is Congress that takes the forefront on this. But it just seems that they subordinate their authority time and time again. And so maybe, they're happy to have everybody upset with Donald Trump as opposed to them, because it's their responsibility, isn't it?
Well, it absolutely is. And this is one of the really interesting features of our Constitution that I think the British and others would have called a fatal defect, and that is that it reposes what were in Europe traditionally, powers of the executive, the power to raise taxes, the power to declare war, and to prosecute war, were all monarchical prerogatives under the British system and continental European systems. And we took those powers, those key powers of state, and vested them in Congress instead. Now, that sounds wonderful in theory, but what happens when the electorate becomes so indifferent, so maleducated, that Congress becomes perhaps irredeemably corrupt? The argument that Trump made was, well, if we consulted with Congress, they would have promptly shared our plans. The traitors there would have shared our plans with the Iranians. Yeah. And they're probably right about that.
Yeah, there's evidence that they've done that before. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so this is the moral dilemma alongside the constitutional dilemma, is that we have this situation now, Bill, where people look at Congress and say it's utterly corrupt and ineffectual. Ditto for the judiciary, by the way, but that's another story. And how do we do this? How can we possibly clean the Augean stables? Well, I know one thing. The executive branch can't do it. Okay, the president won't be able to do that, and we're kind of seeing that. The president can improve the performance of the executive branch, but he can't go in unless he wants to become a dictator. He can't go in and start purging congressmen or judges, for that matter. Okay, so how do we solve this problem? Because it's going to come back again. The next time we have the war, we're going to have these deep political divides that we didn't see. Well, the solution is, frankly, as it always has been, that Congress needs to be reformed at the behest of an aroused and educated citizenry.
Amen. Yeah.
So, and we're a ways away from that, but there are grounds for optimism that we're heading in the right direction. And I guess I would just conclude by saying we didn't get in this mess overnight. As I say, these problems go back at least to the end of World War II, and we're not going to get out of them overnight either. But there's evidence that the American people, or at least a substantial number of them, are waking up. Some of them, of course, are becoming more radicalized, which is another story. But the good guys, the people on our side who want to preserve our civilization and our Constitution, all that sort of thing, are becoming awakened. And it is going to have an effect eventually on Congress. It's already starting to have an effect on Congress. But yeah, no one would like more than me to see a Congress more or less in alignment with president in areas of national security, and perform once again their constitutional duty of deliberation, declaration of war where possible, and then the president goes out and he and the military execute that.
Well, thank you, for the time on this. I also want to address a series of articles that are in the New American regarding the Epstein files. I think people have gotten a little tired over it. Pam Bondi came out and kind of put a nail in her career a bit by promising things and couldn't deliver. But I got to say this, Steve, what the New American has done in providing information, I mean, kudos to all the writers and the staff that have put this together, because it really explains Epstein. I know some people might say, well, Epstein, so what? Who cares? Well, you need to understand what was going on, right, with Epstein.
Well, of course, the Iran war has kind of driven Epstein from the public eye for the moment. The more cynical among us say that was by design. I don't know if there's any evidence for that, but
right.
However it be, that's where we are now. But it certainly is, a major issue, has been an issue for years and years and years. And to be honest with you, Bill, we did do a lot of soul searching here, because one thing we try not to do is to go after we're not technically a news organization per se, so we don't necessarily feel constrained to address every new shiny object that appears in the press, that, some news story. A lot of the things that are designed purely to titillate and distract, if we cover them at all, it's to say these are supposed to be titillations and distractions and move on.
Right, exactly. It comes with a reader warning. Yes, right.
Right. And so that was kind of initially our perspective. Some of us, we had some internal debate as to, Epstein. Some of us were of a mind that, well, no, this is very significant. And others, no, it's just a distraction. Went back and forth, and we finally felt, once the Epstein papers were actually released and we had some hard data to work with, it was pretty clear that we did have an extremely significant event, because it lays bare, possibly for the first time ever in American history, how those in power actually are, as opposed to what they appear to be, the images they project. And it certainly, we talk a lot at the John Birch Society about the reality of conspiratorial activity, conspiracy, the big C, the thing that everybody wants to tiptoe around and pretend, doesn't exist, that somehow the psychopaths in private sector crime, they're conspiratorial, they form gangs and mafia and so forth, but the psychopaths in the public sector don't do similar things. So that's, it's just a kind of a bridge too far for a lot of people, at least here in the United States. Now, most Europeans don't do it, because Europe has been riddled with secret societies and political conspiracies for centuries untold.
Exactly.
Europeans understand this. So Epstein comes along, and now we have this incredible organization that this man and others, malefactors unknown, have set up. And it isn't just about sex and pedophilia and all that. That's of course the most lurid part of it. And of course the news media tried to make it only about sex and pedophilia, and that not to downplay that. That is extremely significant in and of itself. But it's also about money. It's about networking at the highest levels. It's about people who end up being partners in crime and essentially forsworn to one another because they all know one another's dirty secrets.
Right, exactly.
That's how these things are put together. And for the longest time, anyone who made allegations, there's a secret network of pedophiles, let's say, that has great influence, or Satanists. I mean, there's some of that with the Epstein files as well, would be ridiculed. Oh, well, that's conspiracy, that's tinfoil hat stuff, and all the rest of it. So now people aren't so sure. People are going to say, wow, those who took the time to actually look at the most damning material that came out of the Epstein files. And by the way, we haven't gotten all of it yet. They're still sitting on quite a lot of materials. So we'll see if that ever comes out under a new attorney general. But
I'll tell you, it's open so much, as you say, Steve, because it's beyond pedophilia. I mean, we're talking transhumanism, we're talking genetic code, manipulation, eugenics. I mean, these names that we've heard before involved with the depopulation of the world, whether it's Bill Gates, the Rothschilds and that. Wexner, I mean, all these names that have cycled around and round, and as you say, under the banner of the big C, that we're, oh no, that's just a conspiracy. Get away from me. I don't want to talk about it. Boy, and like you said, there's so much more. But even what has been released so far, I can't say that I'm shocked. and I'm not all that surprised because some of this fits the pattern that we've known for many years with J. Edgar Hoover and the FBI, in my humble opinion.
Well, I think one of the problems, and it's an area where we, the ordinary people, the little people, are at a permanent disadvantage vis-a-vis the power elites, is that we tend to, there's a thing that psychologists call projection, where we tend to project onto other people our way of doing things. And so, your average normal American, a person like you and me, we have our modest ambitions. We want to lead happy family lives. Most of us, are faithful to our wives, don't abuse children, want to raise our kids, send them to Little League or whatever, have barbecues in the backyard, live this thing that we call the American dream, which is out of reach for 99% of the rest of the world, and we are apt to take for granted. But what we don't understand is that there's a very small group of people for whom that is not enough.
Right.
People who are, most of them are sociopaths and psychopaths and narcissists of various kinds, megalomaniacs. And, most of us have dealt with somebody with those tendencies at one time or another, someone with a very manipulative personality or very toxic, this type of thing. But these people are far beyond that. Most of them are incredibly hardworking and ambitious and they're driven by the fact that they want to get to a state where the laws and restrictions that apply to the rest of us don't apply to them. Yeah. And most of them, when they were were teenagers, let's say, full of hormones, decided, we're frustrated that, I can't just go out and do anything I want with my sexual urges because there are all these societal limitations, right? And so how do I get past that? And people who don't have that mindset don't understand the degree. I mean, Bill Gates, most people thought, was just a really bright, nerdy guy with a vision of, that ended up being Microsoft and Windows and all that stuff. And maybe in the early days he was that way, but at one point, he was also an adolescent boy as well, right. and so forth. And now we find out, my goodness, we find the real reason why his wife left him and everything else. He's really pervy, and he's actually kind of mild compared to some of these people, compared to people like Epstein himself and others, Bill Clinton and so forth. My point is that I like to say this to people when we talk about politics. Everybody has a tendency to develop fixate on this politician or that politician. Oh, that what a wonderful person, and I always say, there is the occasional wonderful person, even on Capitol Hill, but by and large, good rule of thumb, with politicians and other people who seem to have this unappeasable craving for fame, fortune, and public approval, entertainers and this kind of thing, is that they're not the type of people you would want to have over for a backyard barbecue, and they're certainly not the type of people you would trust alone with your teenage daughter. And that's just a reality. So we're talking about a different type of human nature with most of them. And us mundanes have a hard time understanding that because we just can't comprehend. I mean, and yeah, there are ordinary people in small town America also who abuse children and things like that, to be sure.
Right.
But the level of pathology in the highest corridors of power, in finance, in government, in entertainment, in academia and so forth, is all out of proportion. I mean, most of the men on Capitol Hill, for example, are serial adulterers.
Right.
Okay. And a good portion of the women also. And those aren't the types of numbers you're going to find in your neighborhood, wherever it is you live. That's not that. So, and the same goes with, there's a guy named Petram Sorokin back in the 20th century, a sociologist who did a study of heads of state. And he found that heads of state are far more pathological. He looked at them and he said, like 1 in 5 presidents, prime ministers, kings, etc., were murderers, had committed murder. And I don't mean had started a war, but literally had ordered people killed, that they didn't like. Basically, if they were anybody but who they were, would be convicted and probably executed for murder. 1 in 5.
Yeah. Steve, do you think that they were always that way, or they came in maybe just like you and I with a basic idea of trying to do good, but it's just the environment, particularly like in the DC Beltway, being around all that power and control and narcissism, that it just it takes over their mindset. Kind of like with Epstein. Epstein gets involved with with the Rothschilds. He's got access to money. He gets connected with the CIA. He's getting away literally with murder in some suggested cases, and and he starts thinking like God and comes up with this idea. It almost sounds like Adolf Hitler. I'm going to create a super race. I'm going to use my sperm to create beautiful children and a super race. And you're thinking, Mike, we're not that far away from Adolf Hitler. And we got this guy going crazy. And it's like something's wrong when we have an environment that encourages and produces that kind of behavior.
Well, I mean, power always does that. It tends to corrupt, as Lord Acton famously observed.
Right.
Not it. I mean, he inserted the word tends, right? It's not
Right.
like absolute given. There are, as I say, there are some people on Capitol Hill. Ron Paul, for example, once upon a time, Congressman Ron Paul was exactly what he appeared to be: a thoroughly decent man, a family man, a man who delivered babies for a living, just a good, productive member of society and a darn good congressman during his two stints in Congress as well. As to whether, I mean, some of them certainly are corrupted over time by the system. Some of them, I would say probably the majority of them are already corrupt when they get there, particularly the ones for whom government is their God.
Yeah.
I mean,
yeah, because they've gone through the ranks, right? I mean, they've come up through state offices, maybe local offices, state offices. They've climbed the ladder, and now they're they're in the bigs, right?
well, I mean, the one truism about human nature is that people will worship something. They
Yeah.
can't. We are constructed to be worshipful beings, and if we choose not to humble ourselves before God and the God of nations and Jesus Christ and worship them, we will always find substitutes. And the most natural substitute, of course, is the greatest of all the works of man, which is the state, the government. I mean, governments are the most spectacular thing ever devised by human creativity, both in terms of the potential power for good and for their destructive power. And so people who ultimately turn away from God almost inevitably will worship the government, will worship the state in its stead, and that results in all sorts of perversions. Because then you start saying, well, okay, obviously the state operates purely on the basis of power. That's what governments do. At root, they exercise power. So they then conclude there must be, and this is hardly an original argument, but you see it over and over again in the apologetics of these people. There's really no such thing as morality. That's just for the little people. There's only power, and who gets to exercise it and who doesn't. And of course, they extend that to things like sexuality and everything else. It's just all about power and negotiation and everything, and nothing else really matters. And that's kind of the process, the rationale, I think, that they're led to. And then, of course, when people begin to actually commit acts that alienate them from God, when they become adulterers, when they use drugs or participate in murder and graft and corruption, then it becomes easier and easier and easier to rationalize these amoral things that they do. I mean, that's the best. I've never been very far down that road myself, so it's and if you haven't, it's impossible to comprehend what goes on in their dark little souls. But that's as nearest as I can explain it.
Well, and I think that we're all subject to that temptation. There's no doubt. We've had different
Absolutely.
experiences. This is what has drawn us back to God. And we realize in that process that, apart from God, then you start seeing it according to your own eyes and your own definition. And as they say, when people begin to justify themselves, there's no end to that justification, to where you end up doing things that, let's just use World War II, for example, that these Nazi, we saw them as criminals. They saw themselves as just. They had justified their just behavior for the sake of, as you say, the government.
Well, yeah, and a lot of people don't understand. Again, people who aren't villains themselves don't understand villainry. They assume villains are like Hollywood villains that say, "Ha ha ha ha! Now I can carry out my evil plans," and actually, almost all evildoers, even the worst of the worst, the serial killers and the mass murderers and the dictators and all the rest, at some level, they have a justification for what they're doing. They don't see themselves as being evil, or they'll say, well, evil is just man's natural state anyway. What are you going to do about it? That type of thing. Or they will say, well, I'm a God unto myself. There's no God outside of me. So whatever I think is right or wrong, that I will do. And that's kind of what you see. For example, you mentioned earlier the whole movement toward so-called technocracy. The idea, and that's another false god that people worship today, the god of technology, and they sacralize that as well. They say, well, our salvation will be in technology, because heaven knows God's not going to come down. There is no God; He's not going to come down and save us. So we have to have, technology in alliance with the government, of course, with the benign supervision of smart people like me. The rest of you shut up and let me do my job.
Exactly.
And we'll work this out. That's the mentality. That's the best I can characterize it, I guess.
Yeah. Now, well, we've got a couple minutes left, and I want you to kind of summarize the Epstein story. Why we should care, even with what we know right now. And as you said, in a lot of ways, this is just the tip of the iceberg. I mean, we got emails now that we're seeing. Still, a lot has been redacted, but still, what you're able to read here, like I said, in some hands, not surprising, understanding our humanity and what we can do without restraint. And Epstein was on a road. He had power, he had money, he had influence. He was a very dangerous individual associated with a lot of other dangerous individuals. And this is why the Epstein Files matter, because we've got to find out, this root of this problem that will reconstitute itself. And there'll be another Epstein figure that will take the lead, right?
Okay, well, first of all, Epstein is the one we know about.
Yes.
Okay, so
exactly.
we can probably safely assume that there are, even as we speak, other networks, other malefactors like him, perhaps worse, who are out there plying their devious trades. I mean, the war on children hasn't stopped.
Right.
So there's that. But now the question is, what does it teach us? What do we do about it? And again, I don't want to come across as sounding purely negative, but here is a hard truth that Americans need to relearn. And if the Epstein revelations do nothing more than help us to relearn it, then some good will have come out of this, all this horror. And it is this, and the founding fathers understood it well. If you want to remain free, you have to be vigilant, because even a small limited government, such as we once had in Washington, D.C., tends to attract the most pathological among us. People who want power are drawn naturally to government, at least those that have the ability. If they don't, they become involved in petty crime or whatever. But that's an ineluctable fact. As long as you have government, you will have a sort of built-in incentive for for those types to congregate. Okay.
Yes.
And the only way, and you're never going to, as long as we live in a fallen, imperfect world, you're never going to be able to prevent all of this. Of course, there will always be corruption and malfeasance in the public sector. But the way to keep it at a minimum is for the people to have their eyes wide open and be vigilant, and not say, oh, politics is so messy and unpleasant, and it fills me full of negative feelings. And I mean, obviously, if it does, if you get too obsessed with it, so you have to have some balance, but you must be vigilant. We must start acting like citizens of a free republic and take ownership of this. Watch, keep an eye on our leaders, what they're doing, hold them accountable, and insist above all that all of this illegitimate, unconstitutional overburden, all these regulatory agencies, all the lobbying, all the stuff, all the illegitimate funding that has created this situation, this gargantuan government that has incentivized worse and worse and worse people,
exactly,
to come to power, that we strip that away.
Well, Steve, as we wrap things up, I want to give you an opportunity. Tell our audience how they can subscribe to The New American.
Just visit us at thenewamerican.com, and you can subscribe to our monthly print magazine or a digital version monthly. And with that, you'll also get our weekly Insider Report, which is kind of our weekly take on the latest breaking news. The magazine itself is of a more contemplative, analytical nature. Generally, we don't tend to jump on the story du jour, but instead wait for things to, like Iran, for example. We've actually not said a lot about it yet because we're waiting for things to develop, and we want to make sure that we have all our ducks in a row, as the expression goes.
Well, exactly. Again, thank you very much for your time. Appreciate it. Steve Bonta, the publisher of the New American Magazine. Thank you, Steve. Take care.
Thanks a lot. Take care. You too.
Great job, Steve. Thank you.